Hello and welcome again to TCHL 834 Curriculum Development. In this module, we're going to take a look at defining engagement, which is the first E of the Triple E framework that Liz Kolb has developed and that we've been studying so far in the course. So today we're going to really look at what does it mean when we say students are engaged in learning? How do we evaluate student engagement, particularly when we're implementing technology tools? And that's going to help us in this curriculum development process as we really look at is the curriculum meeting our student learner goals? Because remember, that's our primary focus. So I pulled a quote from the book here that I thought was really important because it defines for us what the Triple E framework is looking at in terms of engagement. So the Triple E framework defines engagement, as students becoming active, social, and focused learners of the content goals. So again, what's that primary focus? The content goals. So really we can look at engagement deeper than just students appear to be interacting with the technology tool. What we really want to look at is a deeper look at considering if the technology is not just capturing the interest of the student, but if it's really engaging them actively in the content. Okay, I know it's easy to get caught up sometimes in the bells and whistles of software or apps, but here we want to take it a step further and not really focus on that, but focus on how students are engaged actively in the content. There's some studies that have been conducted on engagement that really uncovered that while students may be physically present and appear to be actively involved in using the technology tools, in reality, they still might not be cognitively engaged in the learner goals. And so that's what we really want to focus on is, are they engaged in those learner goals? So to get there, we're going to look at two areas primarily, and that's active learning and co-use. And that's going to really impact students' engagement and then have that impact on positive learner outcomes. One of the most critical things that we talk about when we look at engagement is time on task. And there's been a lot of research done on time on task. And there is actually a link of a brief research article, kind of combines a number of studies, gives you some data on time on task within the module resources. I want you to take a look at that when you have some time, because it's really got some important information on time on task. Not really time on task related to technology, but time on task and how we look at it with student learning. So one of the things, of course, time on task that it's critical when we're implementing technology is we don't want the technology to distract from the learning goals. Okay, so that's one of the things we're going to look at as we use this Triple E framework is how do we evaluate whether or not the technology is really allowing students to focus on the task of the assignment or the activity with less distraction. So staying focused on as the instruction progresses, okay? And so how we should see this shift learning is we should see it shift the focus. So the focus is on the assignment tasks or the activities with less distraction. We should see an increase in motivation of students throughout that learning process. And then we should also see a shift in behavior that causes a shift in students' behavior in which they go from being passive to active social learners. There's some interesting research out there on time on task, and I'll give you some data here I want you to think about. One is, and this was some research done on classroom practices. Okay, students were actively engaged in learning 84% of the time during teacher-led activities, but only 70% of the time during seat work. Isn't that interesting? So that really tells us what's the most effective way to keep students on task, right? Those teacher-led activities are critical for that. When we have students doing independent seat work, our time on task drastically declines. The second idea is that seat work and students working alone was the dominant pattern in classrooms studied. So 66% in reading, that seat work and students working alone was the dominant activity that they were doing. 66% of the time in reading. 75% of the time in math, students were doing seat work or working alone as the dominant activity. So that's pretty amazing when we look at what the statistics are telling us is when students are more engaged is during those teacher-led activities. But what our primary instruction we're doing in the class is seat work and students working alone. Student engagement dropped considerably lower when students spent 90% of their time doing seat work. So especially as we get into some of those secondary classes where we feel like students are capable of doing some more independent work, those are even critical times where time on task can be really affected by students doing that individual seat work and not following some of these co-use strategies that we're going to talk about, and some instructional strategies with technology that we're going to look at here in a minute in terms of engagement. So some strategies that the author laid out to promote engagement are really critical for us to look at. I thought it was interesting that they borrowed from reading theory as they picked out kind of 4 primary strategies to look at in the text. And then you'll see there a list of strategies from the website that they provide just in terms of how to promote engagement, what kinds of activities you can do. But you know, that building on reading theory, there's been a tremendous amount of research done on how students learn how to read effectively. It's probably one of the most researched topics in education in our history. And so to borrow from that is critical because we know that that research is sound, right? We know that theory is sound. So the 4 strategies that were identified there was guided practice. Okay, it's kind of a constructivism approach to teaching. So we're modeling for students. The teacher is there really to observe, model, and guide students through the activity. Okay, in a guided practice activity, it's going to be student-centered and really foster that active learning environment. A really common strategy that we use in the classroom, and you may already use this in your classroom, is the I do, we do, you do. If you're not familiar with this strategy, there's a link to a great, really short 3-4 minute video of a teacher modeling the I do, we do, you do in her secondary classroom that may be helpful for you. But this is really modeling kind of a scaffold of activities. So demonstrating thinking out loud as the teacher does the I do portion. Then really demonstrating again that thinking out loud as we do together. And then the student gets to the you do, doing it independently. Co-engagement is also a great way to promote engagement with students because it's getting to that social aspect that we know works for students. Okay, and we know that through research that learning is deepened when students are doing it and connecting with others together. So that joint media engagement, that socially interactive learning, we know from research that that is extremely effective. So when we look at technology tools that help students engage in the learning goals, these are the guided questions that the EEE framework lays out for us. So there are 3 questions that we answer as we evaluate how that technology is impacting engagement appropriately. The first one is, does the technology of all students, does it allow all students to focus on the task of the assignment or activity with less distraction? Okay. So that gets to that time on task question. Second, does the technology motivate students to start the learning process? And then finally, does the technology cause a shift in behavior of the students where they move from passive to active social learners? So how do we get to that co-use or co-engagement? Now, I like how the book lays this out for us because it gives us these 3 questions of how we're going to evaluate engagement, okay, by using this tool. And then it gives us a number of scenarios to look at to really dig into what does that look like. And I want to take a look at just 2 of them, walk through those questions with you, how the author answers those questions to kind of prepare you for the assignment in this module. So if we take a look at scenario 8, okay, this is looking at a 9th grade English classroom, right? They're studying memoirs and biographies. So the teacher asks each student to text message a 6-word memoir and a short biography to an interactive website. And then the teacher is going to display those anonymously on a website for students to access. So let's take a look at the questions and look at how the author answers these for us. Okay. So first, does the technology allow students to focus on the assignment or activity with less distraction? So are we looking at time on task? And Liz Kolb answers this in this way. She says somewhat. The software only has one way to respond and one question to respond to. However, since students have their cell phones out, they become distracted. Management is key here. Okay. So really that on task, time on task with this activity, it's a pretty short period of time that they're on task, and there's a lot of potential there for distraction. So does the technology motivate students to start the learning process? Let's look at that. We know that cell phones are motivating to students, right? Especially our high school students. They want to use that technology. They're comfortable with it. They can participate quickly. They immediately see their results on the website that the teacher is using. So yeah, we can say that the technology is motivating in this scenario. And then third, does the technology cause a shift in the behavior of students where they move from passive to active social learners? Let's think about this one. The software asks students to be hands-on, right, by sending in their own responses. But if the teacher would also ask the students to turn and talk, to discuss their answers or thoughts, it would provide that social piece. They really don't have that social piece in here that we want students to have, and that's critical for engagement. So that kind of gives you an idea of how we walk through those questions with a particular scenario. Let's take a look at one more together. This one we look at an elementary classroom. So we've got a kindergarten teacher here, right? Focused on early literacy goals of writing capital letters. So she has each student come up to the interactive whiteboard to trace letters with the whiteboard pens. This is probably a pretty common thing that we see in our kindergarten classrooms across the state, right? If you're in an elementary school, you've probably seen those early grade classroom teachers doing an activity like this. So let's work through our questions. Does the technology allow students to focus on the assignment or activity with less distraction? So yes, it does, right? The software provides students with that template for tracing those letters, and the teacher is able to observe the activity as they're doing it and monitor what they're doing. So I would say yes, that increases time on task. Second, does the technology motivate students to start the learning process? So yeah, I think it does. The software allows each student to take a turn tracing the letter. And then, although not all students can participate at the same time, students are very motivated to get up and work on the whiteboard. That's an exciting activity for them. And they're also gaining that modeling as the teacher is providing feedback and instruction to students who are at the board, even if they're not up there at the time. So does the technology cause a shift in the behavior of the students where they move from passive to active social learners? This one we could kind of say somewhat. The software asks students to be hands-on, right, as they do the tracing. And it may lead to a social feature where, again, like I mentioned in the last question, if the teacher was kind of providing feedback and discussion as the students were doing the activity. But not all students are tracing at the same time, and it really depends on how the teacher is going to structure that discussion around the letters. So it's not necessarily social activity by its very nature. So those are a couple of scenarios in how we can really take those three questions and evaluate how the technology is impacting engagement. So just to kind of follow up with these and to kind of offer some closing here, we've looked at the first E of the Triple E framework, which is engagement. And so it's really focused on engaging students in time on task, active social learning in order to meet the learning goals. Again, what's the final, the big focus here? It's learning goals, right? And we do that in three ways: focus, motivate, and if it's active. Okay, so focus is really, it's the technology aiding students in developing a more sophisticated understanding of the content. Does the technology motivate students to start the learning process? And does it really cause a shift in the behavior of the students where they move from passive to active social learners? Okay, engagement is a critical piece when we look at implementing technology in the classroom, when we look at what works within the curriculum. But the next module we will look at is really looking at enhancement. And so this is going to be another critical piece of how we look at education technology.